Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today we're joined by CEO of Altis, Stu McMillan. Stu has worked with professional and amateur athletes in a variety of sports with a focus on power and speed development. He personally coached more than 70 Olympians at 9 Olympic Games, winning over 30 Olympic medals. He's also worked as part of national governing bodies in 6 countries and has been part of or led integrated support teams in the United States, Canada, and the UK. Stu has also cured the unique experience of coaching at 3 home Olympic Games, working with American athletes in 2002 at the Salt Lake City Games, Canadians in 2010, Vancouver Whistler, and British athletes in 2012 at the London Olympics. Most recently, he coached British sprinter Jody Williams to a 6th-place finish in the 400-meter at the Tokyo Olympic Games. Very insightful conversation that we have with Stu today. In it, we speak about an influence that we both share, 20th century philosopher and scientist Karl Popper, this idea of critical thinking, and speed training for team sport. It's a fantastic conversation. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Stu. Thanks so much for joining us.
Anthony, it's a pleasure to be here, man. Looking forward to having a good chat.
Yeah, I spoke off the air with you. It's finally great to put a face to the name. I've long since admired your work, learned so many things from you, whether it's your blog posts, the researches you put out at Altis, and part of the mentorship group now as we speak. And it's been a fantastic journey. I wanted to start by asking you, recently, you're in Atlanta now with Altis. Could you take us through this? Could you take us through this move and what a normal day looks like for you at Altis?
So first, I've got a slight beef with what you said there. I've long since admired your work. Is just telling me that I'm old.
Hey, 30 years coaching, my friend. I'm a 40-year-old, so I was 10 years old. Not quite in diapers, but you've been doing it for a long time.
Yeah, I have been, man. And I'm reminded of it more and more almost every day. It's I'm not quite at Dan's level yet. I'm still moving okay. I'm still feeling okay, but yeah, I've been doing this for a long time. Still
Absolutely.
Enjoying it though. Yeah, it's a good question, man. So we were in Phoenix for 9 years, and it was a great home for us. You know, we had a great relationship with the community in Phoenix, most specifically probably with Exos, where we were kind of housed. You know, we rented space from Exos, and that became like a family to us. Like we had a great relationship with Mark Verstegen and all of the staff there. It was a really, really fruitful partnership and relationship that we had with them. But also it kind of began to feel like at some point here, we've got to take our training wheels off and get out and just prove to ourselves that we can do this by ourselves. And it really was, we didn't have any real pressures when we're inside of Exos. It's an incredible facility. We had our own offices there. We had our own conference space there. We could have meetings there. We could have our own, own events there, our own educational events. So it was fantastic. But at some point we had to get out and say, all right, what are we going to do here as a future? This isn't sustainable long-term. It was 9 years. It was already kind of long-term, but we started thinking about, all right, what are we going to do next? Where are we going to be? Where do we want to live? Who do we want to do things with? Because I think the longer that you're in this industry, it becomes more about that, right? Like, where do you want to live? Who do you want to do things with? And what do you want to do? It's not necessarily about the job anymore. It's all right. Let me do cool things with cool people in cool places, and that's all right. Where's the cool place that we want to be? Who are the cool people that we want to do these things with? And what are the cool things that we want to do? And we felt like being in Phoenix kind of constrained some of those things. And Phoenix is a great city, but none of us really loved living there. Like if we had to choose the top 5 places to live in the United States, I don't think any of us involved in the company would have chosen Phoenix, even though it was great. Like it was great being there. It was great for the development of the company. But long term, it's probably not where we wanted to be. And the athletes definitely didn't want to live there. I think there's a significant lack of diversity in the city, where most of the athletes that we train, African Americans essentially, mostly didn't really enjoy living there because most of them are coming from the Southeast or from California and wanted to be somewhere more, where they're closer to family or closer to the things that they were digging. and they just couldn't find that there, and we couldn't find that there. So we knew we wanted to move from Phoenix first and foremost. Then the question became, all right, where do we want to go?
Yeah.
I wanted to go to California, but California is
slightly
too expensive
just
to run a
tad.
small business. Yeah. So that we entertained that thought for about a second and a half, and then it became, all right, where do we want to do this? Like, where do we want to live? And I'm not a big fan of Florida, so Florida was out. I'm not a huge fan of Texas, so Texas was out. And we've got some friends in Atlanta. Brett Bartholomew, who's a friend of both of ours.
Sure.
He's here.
Yep.
And he's been trying to get us to come down to Atlanta for a while. So we took a visit down here last year and spent a week here, traveled around. And, this is a great city. Like, it's a really cool city. We didn't know whether we can operate a business here, but it's really cool. There's a great community in the sport performance world. It's a very sporting, from a general population standpoint, it's very sporty. It's very seemingly somewhat healthy. People are into taking care of themselves. So we felt like, all right, this is let's explore this a little bit more. And we started talking to more people and started to learn a little bit more about the city. And it just made sense. We still don't really know what we're doing here. We just knew that we wanted to move somewhere. Sure. And it became Atlanta. So we're here. Now it's, what's next? The pandemic, as it's done so for so many folks, hit us really hard.
Sure.
Where, prior in February of 2020, for example, digital education was about 20% of our total revenues. That's it. It's now about 95% of our total revenues.
Talk about a shift, right?
Of course, the pandemic, all of that stuff, all of the face-to-face stuff, all of our external contracts, it all disappeared. Some of it disappeared immediately, and some of it sort of phased out over the course of time. But now we're almost purely, except for our track and field athletes, our sprinters that we see on a day-to-day basis, we're almost 100% digital. And we want to, we really need to work on getting back to face-to-face interaction with people, have, getting back to our face-to-face coaching education programs, get some of those external contracts back into place so we can start enjoying seeing people and interacting with people again. So that's our short-term goal here being in Atlanta. How we do that, not quite certain yet. Do we build our own facility here? Do we partner with another facility? So we're working on those types of things now. We've kind of been bouncing around and jumping around for the 6 months that we've been here so far. To get to the second part of your question, what does a day look like? It's very different now. Our day used to be, we'd get to Exos at about 8 a.m. We'd have our meetings as a staff. We're all housed there. We've got our offices there. We've got our conference space there. So we'd have our meetings in the morning. The athletes would come in. We'd do some sort of movement prep, some sort of therapy for some athletes prior to training. We'd go to the track, which is about a 5-minute drive away. We'd do our training. Training would take till about 12:30, 1 o'clock. We'd all go back to Exos. We'd do the weight room based work with the athletes till maybe 2 o'clock. And then from 2 till 5 or 2 till 6 would, run the business.
Sure.
As a staff in the same area. So we'd had at that point anywhere between sort of 8 and 16 full-time staff operating out of that space. And now we don't have a home, all of that is virtual, which comes with many, many challenges, as operating a business and communicating with your staff virtually is extremely challenging. It's really difficult. So now we go to the track, we meet all the athletes at the track, we finish training, we find a weight room somewhere, we go there, we do training there, and we all go home. And then we walk, sit outside of our, sit on our computers and do work until whenever,
Sure.
I generally go to a coffee shop and I do my work at a coffee shop. So that's my day at this point. It starts in the coffee shop, we go to the track, go to the weight room, then it ends in a coffee shop. And then I'll go home eventually at some point and have dinner and go to bed. So it's, that's about it. I look forward to the time where we can once again and we're there now, right? I mean,
sure.
We're kind of back to normal as a society. It's just, we now need to get all our ducks in a row to the point where we can start interacting with visiting coaches again. It's because that's a big part of who we are. It's a big part of how we sort of built our, quote unquote, built our brand, built our reputation of these on-site programs where coaches will come and visit us for a week. And, we as a staff really enjoyed those. So we look forward to getting back to those in the next month or two.
And I definitely want to touch on, towards the end of our interview, more of the products and the services in terms and measures of the continuing education that you're putting out as well, because there's some fantastic things going on at Altis. As mentioned before, I'm part of that mentorship group. It's fantastic. It's been great so far. But I wanted to pivot ever so slightly. I talked off the air with you about reading a lot of your content, probably 5-10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. You'd have to remind me. It was an epic blog. Our coaches continuously refer to it. It's that 9-part series. I believe it's 9-part with Matt Jordan and several of your colleagues. And it was absolutely masterful. But I also remember at the time putting together a book list that you do at the very end of the year, recommended reads. And one of the individuals that you recommended to read was Karl Popper, philosopher-scientist. And I remember thinking, like, who the heck is Karl Popper? Like, this guy has nothing to do with strength and conditioning or science. And I'll be frank, probably one of the biggest influences that I've had in terms of the way I think is Karl Popper after reading his information. Has he had influence on you as a coach? And if so, do you feel the same way in terms of how you critically think and put things together, whether it be programming, problem solving, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. If you zoom out from that slightly, and first the thanks for the words on the series. That's on the old McMillan Speed blog site, and we wrote that from, I think, 2012 to 2014.
There you go.
Yeah, it's a long time. It's a long time ago now. We got to get back to it. We keep saying, Matt and I keep talking together about finally finishing our book that we've been working on for 20 or 25 years. And we'll get there eventually, but at least we have something out there in the sphere that people can read and hopefully enjoy. And we do actually get a lot of positive comments on that series of blogs. So it's, thanks for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. With Popper, like zooming out, like I've always kind of been a thinker and a reader. My mother's a big reader. So I grew up in this reading household. She reads probably on average 2 books a week and has since I was born, Now, she wouldn't read what you and I would read.
Yeah.
But she's sitting there on a chair with a book in front of her. And that's the act, I feel, that influenced me to become a reader. Now, the things that I got interested in were not, as I said, not the things that she was interested in, but it became, for me, early days, is if I wanted to learn something, it was, all right, I'd find a book and read on it. And then one of the things I was really interested in was meaning, and just trying to figure out what this whole thing means. Like, what is our, it's a cliche, but what does our life mean? Yeah. Why are we here? Why are we doing the things that we do? And that becomes more and more specific as we start doing things. Well, why are we doing this specifically? This stuff that we're doing in the weight room, why are we doing this? What kind of impact is this having on the people that I'm working with? And zooming out from that, what impact is it having on the entirety of the system that I'm working within? And what I found with Popper's stuff, and I don't know when I started reading him, philosophy in general is something that I was really interested in from the early 90s.
Yep.
And I'm not a philosopher by any stretch of anybody's imagination, but it's just something that I really enjoy reading. And this is actually interesting. I don't know if you had the same experience, but philosophy was something that I was always super interested in, but most of the people in my circle were super scientific and they were interested in science.
Yes.
I was interested in the philosophy end.
Yep.
So I had nobody to talk to. And I feel like when you have nobody to talk to about things, and this is prior to the internet, you don't remember stuff. You don't retain things. Yeah. You know what I mean? So I feel like I've read and reread the same thing over and over and over and over again. And it's frustrating to me. And I wish, looking back, that I had sought out more people to talk to about these things that I was learning and appreciating. Because I feel like I would know a lot more about it if I did,
Yeah.
But all of the people, like I said, they were super scientific, but not super philosophical. Not that there's a necessary dichotomy within those two things, or not that they necessarily should be, but at the time probably thought that way. So I was always had these philosophical leanings and trying to figure out the meaning of things. And I felt like Popper specifically over some of the others, unless at least some of the other philosophers of science at the time that were popular at the time, Thomas Kuhn and Lakatos and some of the others. I felt like he was one that was really took almost a scientific approach to it.
Yes, very much so.
He's always looking for holes in his theories or in theories. So it's not where Kuhn was, okay, here's the theory, here's the paradigm. And it's just everybody's on the same bus until it blows up. Popper, who's always trying to disprove these theories.
Yes.
And that always kind of aligned with the thinking that I had at the time, right? I was always like a questioner. Like, why are we doing this and not that? Rather than just getting on the bus and, all right, everybody's on this bus. Cool. Let's just ride this bus and enjoy it. I was always somebody that was trying to understand, all right, like, why are we doing this? Why are we not doing that? And that for me, when I started, really getting into Popper's stuff was, all right, this aligns with my thinking.
Yes.
This kind of confirms my current biases. So let me learn a little bit more about this dude. So that's kind of where it all started, right? It's that more critical philosophy than what that was out there at the time. It was more of, like I said, it's more of a scientific way of looking at philosophy rather than, what other people were doing. And it goes back to, even go back to, Plato and Socrates and stuff, right? Socrates especially, it was very critical. He was extremely critical. And then later on with Hegel and Marx and stuff, very trying to dive deep into why you're doing something and looking for ways to disprove it.
Yes.
Which I always found super interesting.
I really love some of the quotes. The scientific result cannot be justified. It can only be criticized and tested. I like this idea of poking holes in your own ideas or your own hypothesis, because I think that's the mark of a great coach and a great program. Two of the books that I love with Popper were Conjectures and Refutations, an objective knowledge. In Conjectures and Refutations, this schema that he talks about, which is, you got an initial problem. You start with a problem. You have a temporary theory, which perhaps it's your program or your intervention. You have your error eliminators, which are, in our case, probably KPIs. And then invariably another problem arises. I thought it was just genius how you could take something like that in philosophy and directly apply it into coaching. I just thought he was a guy way ahead of his time. And I think looking back at it in terms of critically thinking, I don't know if you can teach critical thinking. I don't know. Perhaps it's acquired over time or making many more mistakes and realizing how much you don't know. But he was one of those individuals that really made sense to me in terms and measures of trying to critically address ideas, my own ideas and others. If that makes any sense. Yeah,
that problems thing is great, right? I love what he had to say about different problems. It's like you start with one problem. He said science kind of begins and ends with problems, right?
Yes.
And then whether or not it has grown is measured by the difference between the first problem and the last problem, which I thought, oh, man, I really like that. I dig that, so it's kind of that. Yeah, like you, some of what he said, it was just, all right, this is coaching. This is what we're working on here. We got a problem. Let's work through this problem. It's going to lead to another problem. Well, what's that problem? And is that now a more manageable problem than our first problem?
Yes.
And that's kind of what the coaching process is.
So true. I want to shift and pivot a little bit. I want to talk about training speed for team sport. Obviously, the majority of the listeners here are probably more so than not track and field athletes. They're going to be hockey players. So I want to start with this quote, and I'm probably paraphrasing Stu, so forgive me if I'm doing so. Track and field is the foundation of all field-based sports. Can you expand upon that? Now, I know obviously our environment is the ice, but could you take us through those comments?
Yeah. So this is something that we use as a bit of a marketing message.
Okay.
When we first introduced the foundation course. And it's actually why we called it the foundation course, right? Because there's this thinking in the industry that goes back decades, at least in the track and field area of the industry anyway, that the events within track and field, running, throwing, and jumping, form the foundational abilities of every other sport that you're on your feet for.
Sure.
That's a simple thing to say, and it's a pretty interesting message, and it's something that people can remember, which is kind of the whole key to marketing, right? So we said track and field is the foundation of all team sports or all field-based team sports. I'm not sure I fully and 100% agree with it.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is something we can get into when we talk about kind of game speed and what that is. But from an ability standpoint, from a physical ability standpoint, it's probably pretty accurate, right? Running, jumping, and throwing are foundational to most field-based sports.
Absolutely.
You can't run, jump, or throw, then chances are you're not going to be a very good athlete in whatever field-based sport that you're playing in. Slightly different in some of the other sports that don't involve being in shoes on a field or on a court. Ice hockey being an obvious example there.
Sure. More general question. I realize this is kind of like a shotgun-based question. On a napkin, if you could give me, what is speed? What do we define speed as? What is it? Are there certain elements or pillars that you think are important in terms for team-based athletes in acquiring and procuring speed, with the exception of obviously training it? Are there elements that you could recommend, this reductionist approach? Maybe that's the wrong way to say it, but are there pieces that are important in this equation?
Yeah, this is something we wrote an entire 200,000 word course.
Uh-oh. Well,
yeah. When I get going, it's the hardest thing as any writer, and I'm not a writer, but I've written a few courses now. So I
sure.
say I'm a writer in one sense. The hardest thing for anybody who writes stuff is editing stuff.
Oh.
And that course began at about 500,000 words.
Jeez.
And ended up at just over 200,000. It's like our book, Matt Jordan's book and I is about 1 million words now. And how do we get that down to your typical sort of 70 to 80,000 word book? That's
that's a challenge.
It's not only a challenge; it's impossible. We can't do it. It's totally impossible. It would take years. So it's a really great question, and I feel like, and this is going back to what we were talking about before about being philosophical and asking the why behind things. I don't find that enough coaches ask that question. Like, what is this? Like, and why are we training this way to develop this? Like, What is speed? What do you really truly mean by speed? And you're going to answer that differently if you're a biomechanist or a physicist than you will if you're a coach. You will answer that differently if you're a coach of sprint events or if you're a coach of ice hockey. You're going to answer that differently if you're a coach of soccer or a coach of offensive linemen in NFL football. First and foremost, it tells you that speed is kind of complex. There's more to it than just velocity.
Yep.
Much more. It's much more multifactorial than that. So what is it? What exactly is it? So I think the question that, what you're referring to probably more than just what speed is what is speed in sport? Or what is speed in team sports, right?
Yes.
What does that mean? We can't define it as a single construct, right? And how we define it in the Need for Speed course is it's the confluence and integration of many subcomponents, all interacting and combining at varying levels, the sum of which produce sporting movements at speed. It's a bunch of stuff.
Sure.
Right? It's not just maximal speed, for example, or maximum velocity.
Yeah.
It's when you're talking about speed in a game or game speed, how we've defined it or organized it in what we call the Altis game speed model is we've organized it into energetically determined conditioning abilities. So that's how when we look back at speed from sort of the 60s and even the 50s and the 60s and 70s, it was more of an ability than it was anything else. And then in the 70s, I think it was Schmalinsky and Rilo Pullman, these German scientists and a German coach, that started looking at the neurological aspect of speed. And it's not just this physical ability, but it's also like a skill. Yep. So it's information is involved in this. So it became then this integration of energetically determined conditioning ability and information-oriented coordinative skill.
Yep.
And then those two have sub-components of within this system as well, right? So you've got energetically determined conditioning ability. What does that mean, right? That's different, like linear speed, speed endurance, speed reserve, all these different things make up that conditioning ability, where that other part of it, the information-oriented coordinative skill, like what is that? That's agility or maneuverability, what we sometimes refer to from a blanket perspective as decision-making speed, right? How quickly are you interacting with all the information that's surrounding you in the system of the game. And so all of these different things. So on the third level of our model, we've got 9 different things like acceleration, linear speed, maneuverability, agility and change direction speed, deceleration speed, starting speed, speed endurance, maximal speed, RSA, speed endurance. I might be missing 1 or 2, but it's all of that. And all of that in its totality is speed in team sports.
Wow.
And the important piece here, I think, is that it's the interaction and the integration and the confluence of all of these things together, which make up speed within this system. And I feel like coaches, and then the second part of your question there was they get too focused on each of these little individual nodes within the system in a real reductionist way. And they lose sight of the entirety of the system as a whole and what the purpose of that system is.
Interesting. And certainly a lot to chew on there. I realize that you put this into a course as well. So that's a tough question right off the get-go in terms and measures of trying to solidify all that information. We're a hockey player. How would you define the difference between game speed and speed? Meaning it's great, and maybe more importantly is, can we even train that for hockey players? So you look great. Maybe the best way I could say is you look great in a linear blue line to blue line sprint, but all of a sudden you drop the puck and, the coach tells you you're slow. There's, again, so many things that are involved, decision-making, feel, knowing where to be, et cetera. But how would you define game speed and team-based sport?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And there's a couple of pieces that I forgot to mention on the last bit about the model, where what game speed really is when it comes down to it is object control speed. So the speed of the object that you're playing with. In hockey, the puck, how quickly that thing moves around is going to determine the speed of the game and the speed of the team, right? That's really important. And then synchronized team speed. So how all the players interact as a system together is really important, right? We get focused on these individual players, but it's a team game. How do they move as a construct together? That's really important. So to get to your question, for me, the way that I look at that and differentiate between different parts of what I feel is a bit of a continuum, but maybe not accurately thinking that way. I might have to do a little bit more thinking on this way of thinking. The difference between different parts of the continuum is information, the amount of information in the system. So speed of a hockey player in a game, in the Stanley Cup Finals, in Game 7, in the third period of a tied game, that's a big, messy, chaotic system.
Absolutely.
How fast can you be within that system? Now you go to the other end of the continuum, and now it's in training camp. You're by yourself. You don't have a puck. You might have a stick, and you're going blue line to blue line and seeing how fast you can do it or how fast you can do a lap, right? What's the difference between those two things? The difference is the amount of information or complexity within the system. So one is a super simple system. It's just a skater and a stick, and he's skating as fast as he can. And on the other end, you've got the messiness and the chaos that is team sport, right?
Yes.
So what does that mean for us as coaches then, right? So where is our impact most or best or most appropriately put within that continuum? Because it is a bit of a continuum, right? You, after that first piece, you add a puck. So now he's skating with a puck.
Yep.
Maybe now you add a teammate and he's skating now and he's got to pass the puck back and forth between the teammate. Maybe now you add a defenseman. Maybe you add 2 defensemen. Maybe you add a couple cones now. He's got to go around some cones. Maybe now it's 3-on-3. And all of the thing is you're still working on speed. That's still the goal. Yep. But now the system is becoming more and more chaotic. Now it's a game. Now it's a 3-on-3 game. And I want it to be played maximally or with maximal intent or maximum speed. It's more chaos. Now maybe it's just a friendly game prior to the season's getting going, a preseason game. Now it's a regular season game, but it's with a team that you know that you're going to beat. You haven't lost to this team all season. This team is, they've won 2 games out of 30. So there's not a lot of information in that system now because it's comfortable, there. But the more pressure there is, the more arousal there is, the more information in that system there is, the more chaos there is, and the more difficult it is then for you as an athlete to be able to express this potential that you have of speed. So there's the continuum. At one end of that continuum, you've got the potential to be fast. And then as you move towards the skill of being fast in a chaotic ecosystem, you have potential. Then you've got the capacity to be able to do that. Then you've got the ability to do it. So now we're talking a little bit more sports specifically. And then you've got the technique. So now, okay, you're working on your technique of skating fast and carrying a stick and a puck at the same time. And then finally, you have that technique in context of the game, the skill itself.
Yeah.
So one of our objectives is to figure out where we can be the most effective or have the most impact within that continuum. Yeah. Is it on the potential capacity end, or is it at the skill end? And that obviously depends on us as coaches and what our specific area of expertise is. It obviously depends upon the athlete in front of us. Mm-hmm. If we're working with a 15-year NHL vet, we're probably not working too much on their potential and their capacity.
Yes.
It's a much more chaotic system. There's much more information in the system because they've reached the point of the diminishing returns on all that other stuff. But if we're working with a 14-year-old kid, we might be working on capacity. We might be working on ability. We might be working on their technique. If we put too much information in the system, everything might go in a pot. And then we're not really learning anything there, right? So we talk about the challenge point hypothesis, where there's that inverted U, where if we get too much information, there's too much arousal, there's no learning. So it's just trying to find that sweet spot where that leverage point is within that system that's individual to each athlete, in each game, in each sport, in each part of their progression and their development. Man, that was a bit of a ramble.
Yeah, very interesting. So from a technical side, I just want to make sure I hit on a couple of things. So from a technical side, obviously for a young athlete doesn't have his or her stride signature down yet, it's going to be more of a time where you might tinker and tamper with some technical aspects of speed development. If you're an older athlete who's had that stride signature, you've been around the game, you're playing the National Hockey League, you're not going to reinvent the wheel. You're just going to be more situation specific and put that individual in environments where they need to make decisions quickly. And it wouldn't be such a technical emphasis. Does that make sense? Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's 100% right. And I feel like we bias as an industry towards the stuff that we can simplify and see our impact and understand our impact clearly, which is that ability and technique part. Like if we're working with an athlete and we see them moving differently over the course of a day or a week or a cycle or whatever it is, or an off season, and we can measure our impact that way. Yep. Or if we go into the weight room with them and we see a power clean go up by 20 kilos and a back squat go up by 45 pounds, we've measured our impact. So we bias towards these reductionist methods without really asking the question of whether we're impacting how they play the game. That's the important bit.
So true. And another book, if you haven't read, I've talked to our listeners about this. It's an unbelievable book. Jerry Mueller called The Tyranny of Metrics. And he said many times when you have so many tests, and he's using the economy and academia, not sports science, but he says many times we confuse the low-hanging fruit with a bountiful harvest. And in our profession with team sport, the bountiful harvest is working close to the scoreboard and scaling backwards. And one would argue that's almost impossible to measure. Like, how do you measure that? Like, I don't know. How do you measure hockey sense? I don't know. How do you measure compete level? You can measure heart, but you can't measure heart. How do you measure timing? Those are difficult things to measure. We cling to things that are, I don't want to say they're not important, but squat numbers, vertical jump numbers, not that they're not important, but we're gonna flock to those that are more easily measured, if that makes sense.
Well, in some senses, they're not important. How they play the game is important. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. How are they playing the game, and are they getting better and or healthier with your work?
Yes.
Not how are they, what's their force production numbers? How is their strength? How's their speed? That's not important.
So true. I want to talk about improving perhaps skating ability or speed ability. And I want to be very, very careful with my words here. I'm not suggesting that you're going to improve as a hockey player. I want to maybe, when we look at the literature in hockey right now, skating ability. So not the ability to play, skating ability. If we looked at the correlates with hockey and on ice and match those with what happens off the ice, we'd say that sprinting, specifically acceleration and 30 meters, et cetera, that would be the highest correlate to skating ability. So if we can take that and make it a part and parcel of our preparation process, hopefully we can improve on skating speed, right? Again, looking at the research. My question is, for a hockey player, could you talk a little bit about how we would piecemeal something like that together? We're in the off season now. Is that part of the microcycle for a team sport athlete? Are we going to work? You talked about the complexities of speed. You talked about whether it's speed, endurance, acceleration, max velocity. Is it a 1 divided by n heuristic approach where you're working each of those components in a microcycle? How would we prepare off ice for speed acquisition on the ice? So windy questions, Stu. Sorry, bud.
Yeah, I mean, the first question is, who are you?
Great question.
Right. I mean, we can't answer the question until we know who the person is and what we're preparing them for, where they are in their own individual progression. Where is the leverage point that I'm operating within?
Yes.
Right. So we've got it's potential, capacity, ability, technique, skill. Right. What am I working on? Most people in the industry are working on ability and technique.
Okay.
They're not working on skill. The technical tactical coaches work on skill in most cases. And in most cases, the S&C profession kind of don't really touch that movement part.
Yes.
Some people think they are. Most aren't. Most aren't really affecting the skill of how they play the game with isolationist work outside of the game, right? It just doesn't happen. So what then does technical development look like and ability look like? What are we actually doing there, and how are we organizing the training? Because let's assume that they have the potential to be good in the sport. Okay, so there's something that is capable of coming into being or being developed, right? They've got that. They have the potential. Now let's assume that they've got the capacity to be good at the sport. So the maximal amount of work. Do they have that? Yeah. Let's and many athletes don't, right?
Yes.
So, but that's a reality, and some don't, and some will never have that. So let's say they've got the requisite potential and capacity. And then what we're working on and what we're really interested in is in the expression of that capacity in a sport-specific way, right? That's the ability. That's the definition of ability. Expression of capacity in a sport-specific manner. So if the goal is to make then, or to help develop a faster hockey player, that's then build, these capacities that we're building in the weight room. How can we try to ensure that stuff that we're doing in a weight room has some level of, and I hate the word, I don't believe in the word, but has some level of transference to actually how they're skating.
Yeah.
Right. And that could be doing resisted skating. It could be doing other different things. It could be doing like skating jumps or whatever, whatever that is, whatever. It's not that interested in the specifics of what people do there. But asking that question is really, really important, and understanding the relatedness between capacity or the work that you're doing in a weight room, deadlift, squats, single leg deadlifts, Olympic lifts, whatever that is, and ability, the expression of that capacity in a sport-specific way. You have to ask the question of relatedness between the two, and ensuring as much as you possibly can that there's a level of relatedness that is making or encouraging or leading to the athlete skating faster. Because if there isn't, you're wasting your time and you're wasting their time. And then the next part of that, in a continuum is technique. It's the application of the sport-specific ability, but without context. So now it's skating faster and trying to understand what we can do from a technical perspective to try to encourage that, but still with an understanding that if we're doing that without understanding how it's going to change the way that they actually play skillfully in the game, then again, we're wasting our time, because there's all sorts of guys out there I'm sure there is still in the hockey world. There was when I was more interested in or more involved in hockey, maybe a decade ago or a couple of decades ago. There was, skating coaches, guys that were only their jobs was just to get their skaters faster, right? It was a big industry, get hockey players faster. They couldn't care less where they played the game faster, as long as the player was faster. All right, I did my job, right? Cool.
Yes,
great. That assumption is dangerous, really dangerous. So we have to ask first, what are we working on? Are there some technical deficiencies here where we feel like if we improved the skating technique of this athlete, he could or she could potentially become a faster player in the game? Okay, we're going to spend more of our time here on technique. Or is the lack of technique or the poor technique or the less than optimal technique more related to their ability, their way of expressing their capacity? So they just can't, and you might have a really strong athlete that just doesn't skate powerfully. And the disconnect is in between capacity and ability. So then we're going to spend more time on that, right? How do we ensure that we can get this athlete actually skating in a more specific way, using the strength or the power that they have? So it all comes down to that, that needs analysis of the sport, the needs analysis of the athlete in front of you, figuring out where our most appropriate leverage points are, and then spending time there, especially in off season. Like off season for me is, all right, what is stopping this athlete from moving to the next level? Like, where are the limiting factors here? Is the limiting factor in skill? All right, they've got a great potential, great capacity. They're great in the weight room. They're really, really good. They've got this ability to skate super fast, but they get out on the ice and they got all this information and they're just garbage. Yeah. So why would we work on anything other than that?
It's so interesting. And I remember this and it changed the way I thought. And I'm paraphrasing. I remember a podcast probably 5-6 years ago from Buddy Morris, Robbie Bork podcast. And I had Buddy on the podcast. What a legend, by the way. What a legend.
Yeah, Buddy's great.
And awesome. He made a comment, and I'm paraphrasing. He said, simple programs work very well for both beginners and advanced population athletes, but for different reasons. Beginners need progressive overload. They need repetition. They need time under tension. Advanced level athletes, how they get better is playing their sport. Simple programs can also work wonders for them by not competing with the preparation process of their sport. Hockey is a very unique game in the fact that it is played on the ice and target context, target environment, right? I might be the king of the driving range, but the moment I get on the course and hit it in the sand, what's going to happen? Which kind of leads to my next question. And I know this is not absolutes, but obviously you want to get off the ice during the season. What are your thoughts in terms of training speed in its environment, as opposed to, or should it not be an either or? Because it's important to have, acquire those biomotor abilities off the ice. Would you prefer they be trained on the ice as long as they're short and sweet and it's not, causing overuse to the athlete? Does that make sense during the off season?
Yeah, I mean, the question makes sense for sure. It's you need to understand what it is that you're training.
Yep.
Right. So and that's the question. It could be 100% totally appropriate to do decontextualized, isolated work, go on a bike or whatever.
Yep.
That might be totally and 100% appropriate.
Sure.
But don't feel like you're making your athlete play faster by doing it, because you're not.
Nope.
You're just not. Like, you got to understand what you're doing here, like what you're building. If you're in the weight room, you're not making your athlete or helping make your athlete a better skater or better hockey player. You're not. You're working on that other end of the continuum where you're working on the capacity and the ability and the potential end, right? There's some argument that some of those things underpin the skill or the technique.
Yep.
Right. And that's very true. There's not a player in the NFL that doesn't have a certain level of potential capacity and ability to produce force. Not one single one. Correct. Right? Not one. So you need to have this stuff. So if you've got an athlete that is limited in that and their goal is to get to the NHL, we need to do some work there. Right. Yep. But if the athlete's already further down the progression and you're trying to, okay, you've identified that there's a speed deficit here in how they play the game, you're not improving that if you're doing it away from the game. You have to introduce noise, chaos, and information into the system. You have to, 100%. You have to. And I worked with speed skaters for many years. I was just having this conversation actually yesterday with Andy Galpin and his class, his master's level SSC class, about this very thing, right? This isolated, decontextualized, sort of almost cross training that many sports do, and especially like swimming sports do it, and ice sports do it a lot.
Yeah.
So when speed skaters are not competing, they're on the bike. And the traditional way for many speed skaters to train is they'll do 15 to 20, sometimes 24, 25 hours of cycling a week to prepare for speed skating for one lap, for example, which takes about 34, 35 seconds for men, and 37, 38 seconds for women. And they'll put hours and hours on the bike. So now, does that mean that that's a waste of time? Not necessarily, but you just have to understand what you're doing and what you're actually developing by taking that time to do that, right? Is it for, if you've got, a super elite speed skater who's, close to the world record, and he's not setting the world record, and he's got the ability, he's got the potential, he's got the capacity, all of these is great. Then why are you continuing to spend time? And it's all, you always have to, as a coach, ask that question. So it's funny, right? I had the opportunity to work with that exact person. So I coached Jeremy Weatherspoon for a year and a bit in speed skating.
Yeah.
Who was very fast. He was a former world record holder in the 1,000 and the 500. He wasn't the world record holder at the time. He was taking a year off. And we said, all right, during this year off, let's train as if we're taking a sprint, track and field sprinting methodology to speed skating and this very traditional model. What is, we're doing away with this traditional model and bringing this kind of short to long approach to it.
Yes.
And it was really interesting, super interesting. Like he didn't go on the bike once. That wasn't a problem for him. Capacity wasn't a problem for him. Ability wasn't a problem for him. Potential wasn't. It was all about, okay, can we just skate faster, more efficiently over one lap? I think less than 16 months later, he set the world record. Had the world record for a decade. Like and then the coach, I can't skate, by the way. So I don't put it down to anything that I did to change his mechanics.
Sure.
But a lot of that definitely came down to just putting the efforts and the energies into the area that required it.
Yep.
Not the area that doesn't require it. Right. So yes, there may be a time to hop on the bike and build those things. And that would be probably in the off season, right? You just went through an entire hockey season. Probably some of those foundational abilities, the foundational capacities are kind of at a lower point than they were going into the season.
Yep.
So we might need to, all right, let's boost those back up again. As I said, they underpin to some degree some of the things that are further along in the continuum. So, but once we're there, once we're at that point, let's focus on what really truly matters, right? The technical end of it, the skillful end of it. And how do we then, as performance practitioners, better influence that? Again, that's how they play the game. As you said before, that's really hard. It's really hard for us as coaches, and it's really hard for us then to show the impact.
Big time. You're reminding me what you're talking about with the speed skater, and I get it. It is context dependent. It depends on the needs analysis, et cetera. But it reminds me of this idea with Lance Armstrong, right? Arguably the best VO2 in the world, one of the best cyclists. You can argue the fact that he doped. He didn't. I get it. He did, but I think he finished like 786 in the Boston Marathon. It wasn't because he had a bad VO2. He just didn't train to run. And again, that doesn't mean that running couldn't have helped him when he cycled. That's not the point. The point is, there is when you get to a certain level, perhaps the best way to really focus on issues or trouble areas is the actual event itself in some capacity, whether it's a portion of the event or a fraction of the event.
If you don't have the force producing capacity to skate fast, you won't skate fast.
Yeah.
So work on that.
Yeah.
Build that capacity.
Well put.
It's really that simple. But once you got it, don't feel like you just got to keep on going back to that well, because getting your cleanup an extra 5 kilos or your back squat an extra 15, 20 pounds isn't going to make a hill of beans a difference.
Great points. I want to respect your time. I know we've got If you're okay with it, at least another 10 minutes. Are you good with that?
No problem.
I want to ask a couple things because I know, especially for coaches that don't have experience training any kind of sprinters, you hear this a lot. Just have them run fast. 10 yards, 15 yards, 30 yards. We don't need technique. We play on the ice. Your thoughts with that? I get it. That is an argument that some coaches will make. Hey, listen, I just want them running fast. It's a stimulus thing for me. I just need them running fast. Is there a need for a non-track and field athlete to focus? And I know what we can talk about youth versus pros, but is there a need to have technical coaching, or is it just the stimulus of running fast for team sport athletes?
I think it's different for team sport athletes who play their sport on their feet rather than ice hockey players who play their sport on skates. That's different.
Okay.
I do feel like there's a need for a technical emphasis on all movement. Part of our goal as coaches is to positively impact or affect the way that the athletes move. So a more effective and more efficient mover is generally going to be a better player.
Like,
what does that mean? Like, they have to be more efficient and more effective. So then we need to understand what that most effective model is for whatever the sport that this athlete is playing. Let's say it's sprinting at this point, because that's the question.
Yep.
So what is the most effective model, and what is the bandwidth of variability around that effective model for this athlete in this sport at this time? And for, the more elite you go, the lesser this bandwidth of variability is.
Yep.
And the less elite you are, the greater the bandwidth of variability. So if you've got you line up the 100-meter finalists in the Olympic Games, there's some variability in their techniques, but the main things are the main things. Like, they do and they're all about the same.
Yep.
You line up, 20 football players or 20 high school athletes in a multitude of different sports, and the variability between how the best or the most effective moves and the least effective moves is massive. And that's just the reality.
Sure.
So it is, though, understanding what that, first of all, so then what the model is, what the most effective model is. And I feel like as an industry, we've done a pretty good job of understanding that now.
Okay.
Like, it used to be a very scientific thing that didn't really filter down to much of the coaching community. Much of sports science now, and especially in the sprint science realm, has done a really good job of filtering. So most coaches now have access to understanding, sports science in a way that they can understand it themselves. So we kind of know that now. We kind of know what an effective model is. What we don't know is what is the bandwidth variability around that for each individual, for each age class, for each sport, and where that begins and where that ends. What is okay and what is not okay. So that's a really hard question. I don't have a great answer for that question.
Yep.
But what I will say is effective movement is important. So you've got to have some rules in play. Like, what are your rules? What is important for this mover in front of you? And if they're moving in a way that's for you, that you feel as a coach is outside of what is effective, or outside of that bandwidth variability that is effective, we probably shouldn't be doing that until they're more effective.
Are there any heuristics or simple rules of thumb for coaches that don't have a track and field background that is deep as you? But are there certain elements, for example, in acceleration that you're looking at, or that you'd have a quick look at, whether it's a video on your iPhone and you could play that back in after the session has taken place? Are there any areas that you say, hey, this is simple look around, whether it's shin angle? Are there quick rules of thumb where coaches can assess athletes after the fact without having a track and field background?
For sure. Absolutely. What injuries do we see the most with most team sport athletes? With hockey players, there's a lot of adductor issues.
Yes.
And with team sport athletes on fields, it's a lot of hamstrings.
Hamstrings. Yeah.
Right. So how we protect adductors and hamstrings. When many team sport athletes who don't really know or understand how to accelerate properly, what happens is they push out too low, and they either cast open or they go sideways. So they either sprint down the field or sprint down the track looking like they're skating. Yeah. So going from side to side.
Yeah.
What happens then? There's all sorts of stress on the adductor group. You're doing that? Don't do that.
Yeah.
Just stop. Stop. Okay. And if they're casting out and striking the ground way in front of their center of mass and putting all sorts of now stress on the hamstring group, don't do that. Stop. So first of all, it's understanding the angle of projection and the most appropriate angle of projection for each of the athletes and where they are in their development. The basic rule of thumb here is the more powerful the athlete is, the lower they're going to be able to project. The most elite sprinters on the planet project at an angle that's somewhere between 25 and 30 degrees. So if you're a 15-year-old kid and you watch Christian Coleman on TV and you try to do that, guess what? There's only one thing going to happen to you. Yep. You're going to get hurt because you can't do that. You're not Christian Coleman.
Yep.
Most 14-year-old kids are going to project at about 50 degrees and they're going to be totally upright by their fifth step. But when you see NFL football players run the 40, or you see sprinters on TV and they're not upright until, way later into the run, and you think you can do that, you're not that person. So as a heuristic, coach the person in front of you and coach where they are in their development, right? So one is the angle of projection is really important.
Okay.
Number two is the position of the pelvis.
Yes.
Most of these hamstring issues especially come from a pelvis that isn't controlled well. It's not very stable. So it becomes posteriorly or anteriorly rotated, so the cycle becomes biased towards the backside of the body. So rather than a balanced cycle underneath the center of mass, it becomes biased towards the backside. Bias on the backside means a much earlier swing on the front side and then way too much stress on the hamstring.
Got it.
So position of the pelvis and understanding what affects the position of the pelvis is really important. The position of the feet is really important, especially with young athletes. There's a reason why we cue dorsiflexion so much or flat foot contact on running so much. Next time you go into a gym, find a heavy bag and hit the heavy bag with a relaxed fist as hard as you can.
Yeah.
Okay. I want you to do that. See what happens.
Tell me, I'm going to come back with a cast.
Yeah, don't do that.
Don't do that.
But that's what sprinting is like, right? So we know that if we're punching something, we're going to have a really squeezed and hard fist. If we're punching a heavy bag, we're going to squeeze our fist as hard as we can. Why? Well, it's more force, but we're also protecting the joint. It's the same thing with sprinting. When you're hitting the ground, if the ankle isn't solid, it's squeezed, it's tight, then you've got a much weaker ankle that's leading to much more possible impact and stress to the system. So we always say have a tight ankle in whatever you're doing. Make sure your ankle is tight. So those would be the three main and biggest sort of rules or heuristics that we have for anybody. So, and as long as you have those three, that's it. Like that's probably it's definitely the most important three. And then the variability that each individual athlete has around those is okay. That's all right, especially for team sport athletes and especially for hockey players.
Yes.
Now you can, whether a hockey player should be sprinting in the first place. I mean, that's a totally different question. The appropriateness of that. I'm not saying it's not appropriate.
Yeah.
But for many athletes, it's probably not. I think the risk reward on that is probably in many instances too much.
When you say sprinting, Stu, do you mean reaching top speeds? You're talking like distances under 15, or do you mean anything?
Anything. Yeah. Now that's not to say if you got a 14-year-old kid, you want that 14-year-old kid to be athletic, and you want to introduce a bunch of different ways of moving, right? Including being on their feet. That's important.
Yeah.
If you got a 22-year-old kid who can't run very well, and he's a hockey player and he's really good, don't waste your time trying to get him to run well. Don't. It's just not worth the risk there. It just isn't. He doesn't run well for a reason. And that reason may take you a long time to unwind to figure out what it is. And meanwhile, you've wasted all this time that you could have been doing on the ice or doing more appropriate training. Or basically you could potentially be just feeding, gas on this fire, trying to change what was his natural way of moving into what you feel is more effective to sprint. Well, he's not a sprinter. He's a hockey player.
Yes.
So I don't care about how well he sprints. I care about how well he plays hockey. And that's it. And if you can't sprint, don't sprint him. Just don't. Have him do something else.
Very interesting. That's very interesting. A couple more questions here. This was something I think I really stole from you and Dan, Coach Pfaff. I love this idea, specifically with our advanced level players, our professional players, this 3-day rollover program. I think it's beautiful. Like I literally termed it gain, go, grow. Essentially, your ideas actually from your blog. I'm pumping your tires here. So this first day gain, which is max effort, lifting heavy stuff we're pairing that with acceleration. So higher impulse plyos. Our go day is lifting sub-maximal weight for speed. We're doing more speed work, timing, linear position transducers, time sprints. And then our last day is grow, where we're using some of your methods that you referred to way back in the day, like Parkinson's law. We're doing time, like we're lifting sub-maximal weight for time. And we might pair that with change of direction or curvilinear sprinting. We've found that for advanced level players, we try to get that 1 divided by n approach where we can hit acceleration, a little bit faster speeds, and then change of direction all in that microcycle, really throughout the course, varying in volumes and densities throughout the course of the summer for advanced level players. Do you still use, or are you still a big fan of the 3-day rollover? I know it's been a long time since that article was written. Is that something you still use in terms and measures of frequency for your athletes?
Yeah, absolutely. It began with Dan when he was training. Let's say he's training 25 athletes, and he might say 40 because you know how Dan likes to exaggerate. So let's say it was actually 25. But even managing 25 athletes and 25 different schedules, especially when the competitive season starts, is next to impossible. People are all over the world, they're competing in different places, and trying to individualize all this is just impossible. So the 3-day rollover just became, all right, we know we want to hit these 3 things: acceleration, speed, and some sort of capacity work, some sort of enduring work. Yeah. Now you're going to do it in this order. These are your ranges, and just when you can, just get it done. And then let's talk about the density of that. We can have conversations around it, but you're the leader here because you're there and I'm here. So it's it was great. I've never really had the guts to do that from day one, and actually just, all right, we're just gonna do a 3-day rollover for 45 days, and I'm here with you, and we're just gonna roll these 3 days over. I've always done it remotely. I'm working with a few athletes remotely now, and they're all on rollover programs, all of them. All of them. I mean, it's the best way to do remote programming. Absolutely, because you're not there. Yeah. And just this is it. These are your ranges. So write in ranges. Then there you go. Let me know what you've done. Let me know what the feedback is. Let me know how you're adapting to it. And then when we talk about the next rollover, we know where to go with it. But yeah, it's super powerful, man. It's really powerful. It's a great way to do it.
It's unbelievable. Resources, again, I know we're up on time here. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the projects that you're currently working on with Altis and where you can find them, where the listener can find them?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the opportunity to do that. Altis.world is our website. We've got most of our stuff right now is digital, as I said at the start. We're going to hopefully bring more face-to-face stuff in the next month or 2. Our digital products are one of 3 different categories: mentorships, which you're part of phase 3 now, which is for coaches who are middle to later in the career. We've got phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. We've got a membership, which is called Altis Connect, which is actually just being launched in a couple of weeks, I think. Right now it's called Altis 360, which is just a big repository of video. We've got about 600 hours of video on there. We're going to rebrand that as a new product called Altis Connect. And then we've got our courses, and we've got a track and field series, which we've got, courses for all the track and field events. And we've got 3 big courses, one for therapists or coaches that are interested in therapy and in systems, called the performance therapy course. We've got one for coaches who are interested in speed and team sports. It's called the Need for Speed course. And we've got one for all coaches. It's called the Foundation course, which is kind of the foundational, what every coach should know about coaching before, during, and after their careers.
That's unbelievable. I'll make sure to link this up in show notes. Last question before I let you leave. You've been doing this for a long time. There's a lot of people that have listened to you, learned from you. Stu McMillan, what do you want your legacy to be in this field?
Man, you didn't tell me you're going to ask
that's a surprise one, my friend. That's a surprise one.
I think more and more it's important that we're not even seen, but just good people, man. Yeah. And that's become more and more important to me. Earlier in my career, I wasn't that concerned about being a good person. I was more concerned about being a good coach, and how do I be a good coach? I'm more and more concerned now about being a good person. And then, so the legacy then is, when I'm gone, people think back to me. Yeah, that was a good dude, man. I really liked him. He was a good person. And I'm not that interested in them remembering me as a good coach. Is he a good human being? So what can I do to have a positive impact on as many people on this planet as I can? That's kind of my goal.
Our guest today has been Stu McMillan. Stu, thanks so much for joining us.
Appreciate you, man. Thanks.